Hopefully the last module helped you gain a greater understanding about the different physiological responses that can accompany fear. As you continue your journey towards achieving the freedom to fly, it's important for you to learn a little bit about the ways in which your fears and anxieties have developed and are maintained. Although the objective is not to turn you into a psychologist, becoming familiar with a couple of key concepts pertaining to the ways in which people respond to various stimuli will provide you with key insight into the ways in which you have acquired and developed your fears and anxieties about flying, no matter what they might be. Developing an understanding of how fear and anxiety is acquired will help you to further explore and understand the ways in which these fears are maintained, despite your strong desires to be rid of them. Lastly, I'll discuss the ways in which the acquisition and maintenance of fear and anxiety ultimately leads us to avoid the situations in which we are most afraid. So let's start with a little history. Back in the 1890s, a Russian scientist named Ivan Pavlov was investigating the digestive tendency of dogs. He noticed that the dogs often began to salivate before they received food, and that this reaction seemed to occur when not only the food appeared, but also when any stimulus that had been associated with food occurred, such as someone in the laboratory opening the container of dog food. Although other researchers had observed and dismissed this phenomenon as either insignificant or just annoying, Pavlov was mesmerized by this, and he decided to conduct a series of experiments with his dogs. He figured out that the dog food, otherwise known as the unconditioned stimulus, caused the immediate and unlearned reflex of the dogs to salivate, which is known as the unconditioned response. Now, obviously, this is not all that surprising, as we've all experienced this sensation at some point in our lives, usually when we're hungry. But here's where things got interesting. Pavlov decided to take a stimulus that did not cause the dogs to salivate, in this case the ringing of a bell, and began to pair it systematically with the presentation of the food. That is, he rang the bell, immediately presented the food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, and observed the dogs salivating, the unconditioned response. After doing this a few times, Pavlov was able to elicit the salivation response in the dogs by simply ringing the bell and skipping the food completely. The bell in this example is referred to as a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation that resulted from the ringing of the bell became a conditioned response. This process, by which the bell obtains the power to elicit the conditioned response, is called reinforcement. The more the bell and the food were paired, the more the bond between the two became, and the more the bell came to elicit the conditioned response of salivation. This entire process or procedure became known as classical conditioning. Importantly, conditioning in this context refers to the process of learning. The dogs in Pavlov's laboratory learned to associate the sound of the ringing of the bell with the presentation of their food, regardless of the food actually being presented or not, and they responded by salivating. Make sense? Although classical conditioning can involve something pleasurable, as this example demonstrated, it can have negative consequences, one of which often results in anxiety and fear. To demonstrate this, let's go back to the example of Pavlov's dogs, except this time, let's say that every time the bell was rung, the dogs received an electric shock to one of their paws, which was sufficient to startle the dogs. If the dogs consistently received the shock immediately after they heard the bell and the sound of the can opening for the food, they would quickly develop a negative reaction to the sound of the bell and the can opening. The dog's initial reaction would be to attempt to escape the painful shock. Over time, they would learn, if they were particularly clever dogs, to avoid the shock altogether, perhaps by running away as soon as they heard the can of food being opened or the swinging of the cabinet door where the food was kept. It would only take a few shocks to the paw for the dogs to quickly start to associate the sound of the bell, the can, the cabinet door, or any other sight, smell, or sound associated with the painful shock, and make attempts to avoid anything to do with the situation, even if we're not in the dog's best interest, avoiding the food. Experiments on classical conditioning have led scientists to understand how anxiety is acquired, and thus brings us to the law of the acquisition of anxiety. This law states, if a harmless stimulus, like opening the can of dog food or opening the food cabinet door, is combined with the harmful stimulus, like the shock, the harmless stimulus will have the ability to cause fear and anxiety as well as to motivate behavior. So although the act of ringing the bell, opening the can of food, or opening the cabinet door is in and of itself harmless, because these stimuli are associated or paired with the electric shock, the dogs will react to these harmless stimuli the same way they will react to the harmful stimuli. Perhaps the most important take-home message of this module is that most of the anxiety we feel in our lives comes not from things that can actually hurt us, but rather from things that we perceive will hurt us. For most people, the perceived threats are as real as the real threats. Although this will be discussed in depth in the module on the psychology of fear, as you work towards gaining a greater understanding of your fear of flying and how you have come to acquire it, it may be useful for you to consider the ways in which you have suffered pain in your life. Pay particular attention to negative experiences you may have experienced while growing up. The type of pain you experienced may involve physical injury, actual loss or fear of losing people close to you, accidents, punishment, shame, guilt, and other feelings of discomfort. These experiences may have been signals of pain and disaster for you. It is not uncommon for fearful flyers to report experiencing some of these sensations when flying. Fearful flyers often report the feelings of falling, going fast, being high above the ground, being confined, as well as the experience of loud noises or the distrust of strangers. In particular, figures of authority that are supposed to keep them safe have arisen when they fly on an airplane. For those that have been too afraid to fly, the negative experiences that you have experienced in your life may underlie your fear of flying. A very important thing for you to remember as you gain insight into how your negative experiences in your past may be contributing to your fear of flying is that the various sensations that accompany flying on an airplane, although they may remind you of experiences from your past, are an intrinsic, natural, and safe part of the flying environment. We'll discuss this more throughout the modules to follow. Now that you have a better understanding as to how fear and anxieties are acquired, you may be asking yourself, how is it that these fears can stay around for so long, even when they're not adaptive and may be irrational? This brings us to the law of the conservation of anxiety. This law states, that which is learned stays learned until it is unlearned. Once the neurological process is in place, that is what we have learned, it stays that way until something happens that changes the learning paradigm. Modern science has discovered that we can actually alter our brain structure, or the neurological connections that our brain makes, by changing what we have learned. Although we will discuss the unlearning of fear and anxiety in the next module, often referred to as the extinction of anxiety, it's important to note that once a neutral or harmless event, such as flying on an airplane, has fear attached to it, it will remain that way until new learning, or the unlearning of the fear and anxiety, takes place. This brings us to the topic of avoiding our fears. Have you ever noticed that the more you avoid something that you're afraid of, the more afraid you become? We often find that avoiding situations that we are most afraid of has a paradoxical effect. Unless it is possible for you to stay away from the problem forever, your avoidance of the problem never changes the problem itself. Avoiding our fears, especially ones that we often find ourselves having to avoid, such as traveling on an airplane, does not make our fear get better. Yes, we have avoided something we find painful, but in fact, it makes our fear worse. By generalization, we human beings will do exactly what Pavlov's dogs will do in response to that shock. If we sense that a shock is coming, if we hear that food cabinet door open, we're out of there, just like the dogs. We simply won't take the chance of experiencing that shock again, even if there's no shock to be had. Hopefully this module has provided you with a greater understanding as to how fears and anxieties are acquired and maintained. Although the goal is to overcome your fear of flying, the more you are able to integrate and understand the material presented here in this module, the more perspective you will have on the ways in which your own past experiences may be underlying your fears. So how do we fix this problem? How do we protect ourselves from actual harm, while at the same time find the courage to face our fears so that we can overcome them? We must learn to unlearn our anxieties and fears. See you in the next module.